Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you for coming and inviting me to Duke. It's a pleasure. I'm not an expert on Islam, certainly not a specialist, but that hasn't stopped many people from pronouncing on Islam. In fact, 9/11 has created a whole school of instant experts on Islamic affairs. And a cacophony of voices. Among those voices is a strong school among journalists and others, commentators, who see Islam as a big danger, more than a challenge, a big danger to Europe today. They like to use phrases like Islamofascism, reminding us, or wanting to remind us that this is a kind of new wave of fascism, as dangerous as the one that hit Europe in the 1930s. They invoke 1938, warning against appeasement that would have the same disastrous consequences that appeasement had in the days of Chamberlain, and so on. They talk of Eurabia, Islamicization, the specter of the old continent being taken over for the first time in history after many tries by Muslims, by Islam. Now, the question is, what exactly is the threat? I think, or what do people mean by these threats? I think that you can divide it into three main parts. One is the idea, often invoked by people who talk about Eurabia, Islamization of Europe, that we're losing a demographic battle, using rhetoric that is very common in discourses about dangerous minorities. The fear that we're supposed to feel is that they will outbreed us, that they have so many children that in the end they'll be the majority. Well, they'll have to work very hard to do that, since Muslims, whether they're practicing Muslims or not, but people of a Muslim background, I think, barely exceed 5% now of the European the whole population of Europe. And in fact, as people of a Muslim background, and I use that phrase on purpose because people forget that probably the majority of people with a Muslim background in Europe are not practicing Muslims. But that actually the birth rate is declining as people gradually move into the middle class. So I think we can dismiss the notion of a demographic defeat for the non-Muslims in Europe. This is very unlikely to happen. There is another thing that we're warned of, which has slightly more truth to it, which is that there is a clash of values, that there is a danger from religious orthodoxy, from fundamentalism, or as some people call it, neo-fundamentalism. This is the values that derive from that clash with the values of modern European liberal democracies. And the things that are usually cited as examples of this phenomenon are the treatment of women, subservience of mothers and wives in the family, at home, wife beating, and so on. And intolerance towards homosexuals is another thing that's very often invoked as an example of typically Islamic bigotry, which is causing social tensions in a continent that prides itself on its tolerance and its social liberalism. This, again, is linked to the phenomenon, which is also very often mentioned, of creeping crime, street crime, the lack of safety in largely immigrant areas of European cities, and so on. And this is then often, I even saw actually on an American website, and there are Americans who are stirring up these fears as well as Europeans. On an American website I saw the bad behavior of people of Moroccan, mostly Moroccan, some of Turkish origin, in Amsterdam, bad behavior in the sense of throwing bricks through windows, holding people up, spitting at gay men, and so on. And this was described on a website that was not sympathetic to Muslims, it must be said, as a war against the West, as though there were no real distinction between street kids misbehaving, and I don't want to apologize for them or pretend that that's not very unpleasant, but that there's no difference between those kids and jihadis. In fact, one very common element of this discourse that sees a great threat of Islam in Europe is to conflate all these different strands, all these different threats, to assume that street crime, religious orthodoxy, different habits as far as family life and sexual life and so on is concerned, and jihadism, violent revolutionary ideology, that these are all really part of the same thing. These are all the strands that make up Islamofascism, that it's one huge monolithic threat, and that there really isn't much distinction between street crime that you find in many poor areas, poor immigrant areas, but poor areas in general, religious orthodoxy, and violent political ideology. Let's take them one by one. One should not be too Pollyannish or optimistic about the violent ideology. This is a problem. There is a violent revolutionary ideology that started in the Middle East that's affected some people in Europe, a minority, but you don't need that many people who are bent on violence to cause a lot of problems. A bomb under Amsterdam railway station, for example, would certainly cause great damage to political life in Holland, and it would probably lead to further violence. And I think such acts of terrorism probably, although they haven't occurred very much recently, it's not unlikely that such an act will occur again, and one should take this into account. Now, I think there is a difference between revolutionary ideology of this kind and the reasons why it occurs in the Middle East, and the reason why it has its influence amongst children from immigrant families in Europe. In the Middle East, it started very much as a rebellion against failed secular police states, dictatorships. People often forget that most governments in the Middle East, of course, are not Islamic governments. On the contrary, they're secular dictatorships. And they are seen, rightly, in many cases, by the population as corrupt elites who are hypocritical, who have taken on the worst aspects of Western, what is seen as Western decadence, and the way to rebel against these failed police states often is through the mosque, as a way to mobilize people, as a source of morality, and so on and so forth. This is really how it started. And by extension, of course, first of all, the elites are associated with wicked Western decadence, and then by extension, the West itself, Western countries also become targets. Now, this has affected the behavior of young people of Muslim origin in Europe because it's a ready-made cause for young people, mostly young men, who are, for one reason or another, feel dislocated, discontented, angry in the societies in which they were born. It's, of course, not unique to young men of Muslim backgrounds. I've often thought that if one wants to understand the motivations of somebody like the killer of Theo van Gogh, a man of Moroccan origin called Mohammed Bouyeri, born in Amsterdam, it's not much good reading the Quran. since he himself really had a very sketchy knowledge of Islam. I mean, he grew up largely as a secular kid in Amsterdam, and much of what he later came to know about his particular violent and purist variation of Islam was downloaded from English websites, usually subsidized by Saudi Arabian sources from the internet. He was not somebody who was born in a deeply religious family. He wasn't really religious at all until he became an extremist, which is a common pattern amongst young men in Europe who are attracted by jihadi ideology. Another example of this is the leader of the young men who put bombs in the London Underground. One of the leaders was called Mohammed Siddiqui, known as Sid to his friends at school in the Midlands. He played cricket, he drank beer. He seemed, like Mohammed Bouyeri in Amsterdam, a well-integrated young man until something went wrong. And that something could be many things. In his case, he was part of a group of people who wanted to do something. He was a do-gooder, again, like Mohammed Bouyeri, who also was interested in social work and so on, to begin with. He wanted to do something about the problems of drugs and criminality and violence in his immigrant community in the Midlands. And he felt attracted by Wahhabism, the Saudi-sponsored form of purist Islam. And the reason he felt attracted to that, and not the Islam of his parents, which was much more an Islam to do with the village culture in the part of Pakistan that his parents came from. The language used in the mosque was Urdu, not Arabic. And he was alienated as much from that as he felt, in the end, from the society in which he was born. And the reason that Wahhabism, this very purist form of Islam, appeals to such young men is precisely because it doesn't have deep cultural traditions or roots or associations. It's an ideological form of purism which can be adopted by anybody, as it were, from the internet. And the reasons, again, I think that young people everywhere are vulnerable when they're confused enough to violent ideologies. The reason that these particular young people are perhaps even more vulnerable than others is because they're of the generation that is neither one thing nor the other. They are cut off from the cultural roots of their parents or their grandparents, but not enough, don't feel at home in the only society which they really know well, whether it's Britain or Holland or Germany or France. And that, of course, makes them vulnerable to violent or ideological causes which give them a sense of power, a sense of home, of belonging, of identity, something to sacrifice your own life for if you're romantically inclined in that way, or even kill others. But I think the main point to bear in mind that this is not a question of clash of civilizations, of one tradition clashing with another, because the jihadis, at least, are certainly, and I think the same thing goes for many of the neo-fundamentalist Muslims, who are not necessarily violent, who don't necessarily have a revolutionary project, but are drawn to Wahhabism and other forms of purism. That these are modern phenomena and are not reflections of an alienated tradition that somehow rubs against a different tradition of the West. The conflation, I think, of these different perceived threats, religious, political, social, are made both by people on the right of the political spectrum and the left. The right, again, is divided, as is the left on this. You have a traditional, socially conservative right wing, which is never, under the best of circumstances, comfortable with alien cultures in their midst, are often drawn to a sense of order and cultural conservatism. But then you have what I think at the moment is a much more serious and more problematic right wing, which is right-wing populism, which is largely focused now on anti-immigrant issues and specifically anti-Islamic issues. And I think that their anti-Islam, their attitude against their fear of Islam in Eurabia and so on, is part of actually a much wider problem, which is not really specifically to do with the particular problems of immigrants or Islam. It has to do, I think, with a general sense of anxiety, which it doesn't only exist in Europe, it's everywhere now, also in the United States, to do with globalization, to do with the sense amongst a lot of people that they are being left behind in this new globalizing world, that in the new world that we're living in now, there is a new division of haves and have-nots, those who benefit from borderless capitalism, from a global economy and so on, and those who feel that they're losing out in this. This is, of course, linked to their fear. I mean, the direct focus of this fear is the immigrants in our midst. But I think it's a reflection of wider anxieties. And the rage that is felt by many of these people who follow right-wing populist politicians in Europe is only partly directed at the immigrants themselves, but much more importantly, it's directed at the political and cultural elites in Europe, who are blamed for all these problems, who are blamed for the anxieties that people feel about a bewildering world in which people feel that they don't know where they belong anymore. The sovereignty of national governments in member states of the European Union has become vague. It seems to many people that somehow national destinies are now much more affected by faceless bureaucrats in Brussels and multinational corporations than they are by elected European governments. There is this general, and again, the Brussels bureaucrats are also part of these elites that are thought to be making decisions over the heads of the common man and have no understanding of the problems and the anxieties of the common man. And immigration is very much part of this. Immigration, unlike in the United States, in Europe has been a rather disorderly process. It began, of course, in former colonial countries or colonialist countries. It began with former colonial subjects who came to Europe, in Pakistanis, Indians, West Indians, and so on. In Britain, people from Suriname, Dutch Guyana, and Holland, and the Antilles. But they are really no longer perceived as a great problem. In fact, I've heard it said by black people from Suriname living in Holland that nobody talks about them anymore. They sort of feel slightly left behind in the public discourse because they're not seen as a problem. And they supply the best players in the Dutch national football team, which has also been an important, has played an important role in the integration of the community. No, the problem really began with the guest workers, the Gastarbeiter in German, who came in the 60s and 70s. They themselves were not a problem. These were men, some of them illiterate men, from villages in Turkey, the Rif Mountains in Morocco, and so on. And they were much too busy to cause any problems, nor did they have any desire to cause political problems. They worked extremely hard at jobs that Europeans no longer wanted to do, cleaning trains, working in factories, doing dangerous and dirty work, and lived in depressing boarding houses and sent much of their money back home to their families in Turkey or Morocco. The problems began when these people, contrary to expectations, did not return to their countries but stayed. And then it became an issue, can you really let these men fester in these boarding houses? Wouldn't it be fairer to allow them to bring their families, their wives and so on to Europe? And by and large, governments decided that that would indeed be fairer, and so people started coming. And too quickly, probably, many old working-class neighborhoods in European cities began to change fundamentally. Suddenly, the presence of a large number of people who were indeed exotic and alien to the original inhabitants, in the eyes of the original inhabitants, started to transform the way European cities looked, the atmosphere, the culture, and so on. And this began to cause problems, but even that was not the source of the main problems. The main problems really began, the social problems and the political problems in terms of jihad and new religious fundamentalism, came with their children, who were born there but didn't feel at home there. And when people, at least in the 80s and 90s, started pointing out that there were potential tensions coming from this rather disorderly process of immigration, which was never officially acknowledged as immigration, these people were often dismissed as racists and shut up. And the people who dismissed them tended to be well-meaning, often left of center, social democratic politicians, social workers, intellectuals, and so on, who, scarred by the memories of World War II, were terrified in Europe of new forms of racism that could cause a return to the sins of the past. And so out of often well-meaning attitudes, a sense occurred amongst many people that these problems of immigrants, of Islam and so on, could not be properly discussed. And this has added the fuel to the rage of people now against the elites, who are blamed for bringing these people in and for shutting people up when they wanted to complain about the problems that occurred. On the left, there's been a similar division, I think. On the one hand, you still have the old, it's now a dwindling number, and I think people who talk about Europe as being hopelessly addicted to cultural relativism and appeasement of non-Western cultures and nihilism and so on and so forth are really flogging a dead horse by now. But there is still an old multicultural ideological left that feels that non-Western people from non-Western cultures always should be privileged over Western cultures and so on, and that to as it were, as people would put it, to impose our values on them is a form of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism. They are right, we are wrong. That left still exists, but there is a new, I don't know what to call them, a neo-left, a former left, which I think really was galvanized and came to the forefront with the Salman Rushdie case. Salman Rushdie himself was, of course, very much of that old left, metropolitan left, multiculturalist, very much opposed to any form of Western neocolonialism or imperialism, cultural imperialism, and so forth. But when his book suddenly was burnt in public by young Muslim men in Britain, this was seen as a kind of betrayal by the left, who before that would have stood up for those young men, whatever they did or thought. And all of a sudden, the mood began to shift, and people of that left began more and more to talk like the populists and the social conservatives and find a kind of common cause against what was perceived as the Muslim threat. Now, there are other reasons for this too. I think a lot of the people who formed the New Left in student circles and intellectual circles in Europe after the 1960s often came from religious families themselves, from conservative backgrounds. They rebelled against it in the 60s, in their terms liberated themselves or emancipated themselves from their religious backgrounds and created a kind of new consensus, a new liberal consensus in Europe, which was largely secular, anti-religious even, and as well as being multicultural. And indeed, recently, of course, people tend to look on the differences between the United States and Europe largely from that perspective, that the United States is still hopelessly stuck in atavistic religious bigotry, whereas the Europeans are all wonderful secularists. People forget how recently Europe was still highly religious. And certainly the country I grew up in, even though I myself came from a non-religious background, but in Holland, if you switch the radio on a Sunday morning, there was nothing to listen to except sermons from various denominations. And so this so-called European secularism really is rather recent and may not last. But the 1960s left certainly sees secularism, gay rights, feminism, and so on as an acquired liberal consensus, which is now suddenly being upset or threatened or challenged by these new immigrants who are, in the words of Pim Fortuyn, an interesting populist and anti-immigrant politician in Holland, who are about to force us to fight all these old battles all over again. Now, Pim Fortuyn was especially interesting because unlike many right-wing populist politicians in Europe, in Austria and France and other parts, he did not come from a fascist or national socialist or racist tradition, which in Holland is actually, there isn't much of a tradition of that kind. He himself was openly and flamboyantly gay. And his main argument against Islam and against the immigrants of Muslim background was precisely that they were a threat to the kind of liberal values that he espoused, i.e. gay rights, gender equality, and so on. And this has now become a big stick with which to hit the Muslims over the head, fairly or not. And quite recently, and this has led to strange, paradoxical attitudes. Recently, I came across a speech made by, again, a Dutch populist politician called Geert Wilders, whose only program really platform is anti-Islam, anti-immigrants. He believes, he has said so, that the Quran should be banned. The Quran he has compared to Hitler's Mein Kampf, it should be banned. Dutch citizens with immigration backgrounds, but people who have Dutch passports, from a Muslim background, if they commit crimes, should be deported, in his view. Muslim immigration should be stopped, in his view, and so on. And and he's become immensely popular, especially amongst people who would traditionally have been very much on the side of the sort of populist right wing, provincial, fearful of foreign cultures, and so on. And he gave a speech in Jerusalem recently. This is, of course, another thing that's been inspired, I think, by the anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe, that now even right-wingers find themselves to be great philo-Semites. That's somebody who probably 50 years ago would have been an anti-Semite, now finds himself on the plane to Israel all the time. And he gave a speech to a so-called anti-jihad conference in Jerusalem, in which Geert Wilders made the following point. He said, Amsterdam is the gay capital of the world. How can it remain the gay capital if Muslims get beaten up in the street, if gays get beaten up in the street by Muslims? Now, I have no idea how this was received by this audience in Jerusalem, not known as a city that's particularly warm towards gay culture. And I very much doubt that the most followers of Geert Wilders in Holland now, and certainly before, would have been tremendously keen on the idea of Amsterdam as a gay capital. But it shows really how values have, on the one hand, how values have shifted, how there is indeed a liberal consensus in most parts of Western Europe that now takes a kind of nationalistic pride almost in such things as gay rights and gender equality. But it also shows how this has become a very convenient stick for people both from the left and the right to beat Muslims over the head with and find common cause. Now, if there were to be an election tomorrow, Geert Wilders probably would end up having the biggest political party in the Netherlands, which is extraordinary for a country which has never really had more than 10% of the population who was interested in anything to do with radical populism of this kind. Now the danger, and I'll conclude with that, I think the danger of conflating in this fear that is being stirred up of Muslims in Europe, the danger of conflating violent political ideology, which I repeat is a problem. It's not going to tear Europe apart, but it's a problem, and crime and religious orthodoxy, is that it would, if it succeeds in convincing enough people in Europe that there is this monolithic danger, the result will be that we alienate the very people we need, and when I say we, I mean liberals, Democrats, and so on, that the people we need on our side to defend precisely the values that people who warn us against Eurabia say they are defending. Because the only way, I think, that the violent revolutionary element will be defeated, and it has to be defeated, apart from good police work and intelligence and all that, which is certainly necessary, but the only way that it will be defeated is if it can be isolated within the immigrant community itself. And when I say immigrant community, it's a very diverse community, of course, but the moderate Muslims, the peaceful Muslims, the law-abiding Muslims, must be given the sense that it's in their interest to make common cause with the liberal democracies of which they are citizens against violent revolutionaries who mean it harm. If we do not make these distinctions and we push people into a corner, the only result will be that more jihadis will be recruited, and that even if people don't become jihadis, they will feel a certain sympathy for them and make it much harder to root it out. Now, this is a risk. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think there are signs of hope as well as real grounds for worry. The signs of hope are when you walk through most European capitals now, whether it's Amsterdam or Berlin or London, you'll see a completely mixed view. You'll see young women in headscarves and jeans walking arm in arm with young women without headscarves and tank tops, often their own sisters. But perhaps the most hopeful thing I saw when I was doing research for my book on the murder of Theo van Gogh was when I went to interview a law professor at Leiden University. And he is himself of Iranian origin, a man called Afshin Elian. He comes from the old Tudeh left in Iran. He had to escape from the religious revolution, and has become a very strident voice against the Muslims. He is one of the people who is stoking up fears against the Islamic presence. And we were having lunch in the canteen of the law faculty of Leiden University. And he was holding forth on the dangers of Islamism, the danger of appeasement, the danger of being too soft on the Muslims, the enormous threat they posed, and so on. And as he was talking, I was looking around me. And I noticed that probably the majority, certainly a large number of the students having lunch in the canteen were young women in black headscarves. And this is not for nothing. The young Muslim women are becoming the super achievers at Dutch universities. And the reason that they do this, the reason they work so hard and often study law, is because it's a way to get away from the authoritarian strictures of their conservative families. It's their way of emancipating. But if they'd been all worn jeans and tank tops, I think I would have been less optimistic. It was precisely because they had chosen, on the one hand, to study law, to make their way in the European society of which they were citizens, and to be religious in the way, in their own way. And I'm not saying this because I think religion is a wonderful thing, or because I think that Muslims should wear headscarves. But I think the fact that they felt that both were possible, that you could combine both, is a source of hope, because that means that there will be in future a European Islam, a form of Islam that can coexist with all the liberal democratic values that we should indeed defend against its enemies. And on that note, I will stop and invite you to ask me questions. Thank you. Yes. Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah. But people don't have to walk all the way up to the microphone. Okay. All right. Oh, okay. I've seen you. Okay. Okay. Where's the mic down here? Oh, there. Okay. Why don't you start while this gentleman walks to the mic?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. I spent 6 months last spring in Amsterdam and read your book and was looking at the education system there, and it's really nice to meet you in practice, or in person. The question I have is about the differences across some of the European countries. You talked a lot about the Netherlands. I was interested last spring when Geert Wilders was kept out of Great Britain, although I think he's being allowed in now, but that suggested that there were different approaches to dealing with right-wing populists such as Geert Wilders in the different countries. Could you talk a little bit about those differences?
But the differences between the right-wing populists.
Well, in the different European countries.
Yes. No, I think there are clear differences. One of which I alluded to, which is that countries with the populism reflects the history of the country to some extent, and so in France, for example, Jean-Marie Le Pen was, I believe, a paratrooper in the Battle of Algiers. There is, certainly since the late 19th century, a radical right-wing tradition in France, which had its moment in the sun thanks to the German occupation during the war, but the tradition has been there, the anti-revolutionary, often Catholic, anti-Semitic form of right-wingery. So Le Pen in many ways reflects that, and I think in his case, ethnicity has something to do with this, as it would often do in the case of Austrian or German right-wingers of that kind. The Netherlands doesn't really have that, although there was a National Socialist Party in the Netherlands, and there were collaborators during the war, and there was a Dutch SS regiment and so on. Politically, that kind of tradition has always been very weak. And so what you have in Holland, and both Wilders and Geert Fortuyn illustrate that, is a very strange kind of new nationalism, which takes the idea of sort of freedom and liberalism and gay rights and all that kind of thing as a form of chauvinism that has to be used against the perceived threat of immigrant communities. And so it's a strange variation of populism. But on the other hand, it's just as anti-elitist and nationalistic as the others. And even though he talks about, or both Fortuyn and Wilders talk about gender equality and gay rights on the one hand, on the other hand, they also talk about going back to the country where we were still amongst ourselves, our old values, order, and so on and so forth. So it's a mixture of things. Now, on his not being allowed into Britain, that was a very foolish political move, in my view, to bar a politician from entering another European country. But we talked about in a smaller circle already earlier today. Of course, no European country has the equivalent of the First Amendment. And it was precisely the liberals that were always accused by the conservatives and the anti-immigrant people of being soft on militancy, on being relativistic, on allowing mullahs in mosques to spout their hatred and so on. And rather stung by these criticisms, the Labour Party Home Secretary in the United Kingdom decided that that kind of language had to stop, mullahs of that kind had to be sent back, and a long tradition in Britain of allowing people from overseas to have their radical ideas as long as they didn't break the law, effectively came to an end. And they did get tough on these people. But by the same token, if a mullah who is guilty of inflammatory language has to be taken to task, it was felt that the same thing should apply to a man like Geert Wilders for antagonizing the Muslim minority and stirring up xenophobia and so on in the view of the British Home Secretary. So there was a certain logic to her decision, but it made him into a hero of free speech, which is not perhaps the most desirable outcome.
Thank you for your good, great speech. I just would like to get your opinion on Tariq Ramadan, who I'm sure you have had a chance to interview, and who is perceived as a great voice of moderation and actually in bridging that gap between Islamic orthodoxy and liberal democracy. And unfortunately, such a voice that is much needed to bridge that gap is being suppressed. And as we see by recently, actually, a seminar he was holding in Amsterdam, in the University of Amsterdam, about immigration and identity, or citizenship and identity, has been terminated under pressures. So, and unfortunately, he's been denied entry even in the U.S. At a time.
Not anymore, I don't think. But
I don't know. I'm not sure,
right.
But from what I read in a newspaper, that even the Obama administration was not inclined to allow him here. Mm-hmm. That's one question. The other question is I would like to ask you generally about the integration of Muslims in the experience of Muslims or immigrants in Europe with the one here in America, where it seems that in America there's much more integration than in Europe.
Right. Does everybody know who Tariq Ramadan is? Okay, for those who don't, I'll give a quick thumbnail sketch. He was born in Switzerland. His grandfather was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So he has a family tradition of political Islam. His brother is a radical political Islamist and represents the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, in Geneva. And Tariq Ramadan became an intellectual activist, gadfly, and I'm not sure the word oppressed or suppressed is quite right, because he writes his books, he gives speeches all over the place, he's very media friendly, he's become a kind of celebrity of a kind. Now, what his program is not always entirely clear. Ramadan tends to want to be friends with everybody, but his goal is fairly clear, and that is to combine religious orthodoxy. He doesn't pretend to be an Islamic reformer or a liberal or anything like that. He calls himself a Salafist. He wants to go back to the original quote-unquote sacred books, and he wants to combine that with being a democratic European citizen, and even being an activist European citizen. And he does not see Muslims in Europe as a minority. He does not want minority rights or minority privileges. On the contrary, he wants his Islam, to be the kind of ethical basis for political activism in Europe. He wants Islam, in other words, to be part of the mainstream of political activities in Europe. Now, even though he is a conservative, orthodox Muslim as far as his religious beliefs are concerned, his politics are rather different. His politics are a slightly old-fashioned version of sort of 1960s, 70s, third worldist leftism. He believes in sort of liberation movements, the Black Power movement in the United States. He's a kind of weird combination, if you like, of the late Jerry Falwell in his religion and Noam Chomsky in his politics. Now, this might not be a very practical combination to strive for, but that's what he's doing. Now, I'm inclined to believe that he is part of a solution, because anybody who tries to combine, as the young Muslim women I just described in the law faculty, who try to combine their Muslim belief with the duties and rights of being a European citizen, needs to be encouraged. And he has a real voice which appeals especially to educated Muslims in Europe, who want an identity of their own, but who also feel that they're Europeans. He's come into a huge amount of flack. He's a figure of great hate to many people in Europe, especially in France, but not only in France. And I think one of the reasons for this is that if you take the view that Islam, belief in Islam, is inherently incompatible with the values of liberal democracy, then anybody who pretends that that is what he's aiming for has to be either speaking in bad faith or a naive fool. And because he's clearly neither naive nor a fool, people assume he's speaking in bad faith, that he's playing a double game, that he says one thing to his followers and another to non-Muslim audiences, that he's a liar, and so on and so forth. Not precisely because he says he wants to combine his religion with democracy. He has to be a liar because this is impossible. And then, of course, he's also tarred with the brush of his family history. People assume that because his father, his grandfather, his brother were very much political Islamists, that he himself has to subscribe to all their views. He doesn't make it easy for his defenders often, because he has said things specifically about the Palestinian issue in Israel, which do not inspire confidence. He has got himself involved in things like closing down a play by Voltaire in Switzerland that supposedly was disrespectful to the Prophet Muhammad, and so on. So he's not an entirely kosher figure, if one can use that word in his case. But I think he deserves the benefit of the doubt, and for that I myself have also come in for my share of flack. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the microphone. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, excuse me. I think that any practitioner of any religion would posit that perhaps the hypocrisies that are guised behind liberal democracy or liberal democratic political regimes are incompatible with their faith. And so, you know, a little nuance. Also, perhaps immigrant populations are apt to study law because it's an excellent venue for engagement with a hostile body politic, as opposed to simply wishing to get out from under the systems of control, patriarchy, whatever else. You mentioned in your talk that 60s and 70s leftists were dismissive of right-wing critiques of immigration because they were very, very leery and very much against positing neocolonialism and cultural imperialism. In that context, I agree that your assertion is true, though neocolonialism is a very real thing when one looks at the relationship of European countries with their former colonies, whether it be in Africa, in the Middle East, or in Asia. And so my question is, what policy changes, and I realize this will be nuanced because there is no one Europe, you know, like there's no one America. What policy changes do you, policy changes, economic, political, what foreign policy changes do you think, you put the onus on the Muslim community to sanction itself as with regards to policing radical politics. What foreign policy changes do you think European governments could engage in that would quell the growing radicalism amongst immigrant populations and first-generation youth?
Okay. I'll try to take those one by one. I also failed to answer the second question of the former speaker, which I will get to. Yeah, the left of the 1960s and 70s, and I don't think that there is a great difference between Europe and the United States in that respect, often even saw the defense of the Enlightenment and what is now called Enlightenment values as a form of neo-imperialism. The idea that the conceit that somehow the Enlightenment was anything more than simply an aspect of Western civilization, and the idea that this was in any way universal was seen as a form of neo-imperialism. And it's often these very same people who now become vociferous defenders of what they call Enlightenment values against the Muslim challenge. Now, your question assumes that it's European foreign policy that is the main reason or main driving force of Islamist, radical Islamist ideology amongst immigrants in Europe. And I'm not sure that's entirely the case. It certainly doesn't help the perception that the West and Europe is always on the side of Israel, for example, in problems with the Palestinians. I mean, whether that perception is true or not is another issue, but that it is perceived in that way by many people from immigrant communities who watch Al Jazeera and so on, and that certainly doesn't help. But I don't think it's the main reason for radicalism amongst people of Muslim background in Europe. I think it has much more to do with their still fragile position in European societies. And that on the one hand, they don't share the identity of their cultural identities of their fathers who came as guest workers, but feel often rejected, discriminated against, not at home in the country of where they grew up. And this is where the radicalism can be a very appealing way to bolster one's sense of giving oneself a sense of power, of belonging, of identity. And I'm not sure, even if the problem in Israel would be solved tomorrow, and Western governments would all suddenly turn on Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which is highly unlikely, but let's say that were to happen. I'm not sure that would suddenly mean that there would be no more Islamist radicalism in Europe. I think it would still go on, and there would be other reasons. I mean, people would then use other foreign policy reasons for their sense of humiliation and rage, but I don't think it's the main driving force. The second part of the question that I didn't get to just now, the differences between the integration of Muslims in Europe and the United States. Well, one thing to bear in mind, I think, is that they're not quite the same. First of all, they're not quite the same people. Many people from the Middle East, immigrants from the Middle East, whether it's Iran, Iraq, Morocco, Maghreb, in the United States are middle-class, educated, and often Christians. And the other great difference, they're not from small villages, they're by and large not illiterate. Also they're much less conspicuous. it's one minority amongst many others, and except in pockets like Dearborn, Michigan, they don't dominate any particular community or city, whereas the majority of immigrants in European countries are of Muslim background, and you could get the impression, walking through certain areas of Brussels or Amsterdam or Paris, that there's a huge Muslim population that might one day even dominate the city, although that's unlikely to happen in my view, but you could get that impression, whereas you would never get that impression in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. So I think that's another difference. The third difference, I think, is that even though in terms of social security, economic life, let alone, as we all know, healthcare, the United States is a much harsher society than all European liberal democracies, where the state does tend to protect its citizens to a much larger extent than is the case in the US, where the citizen is left more to his own devices. And European social democracy and the welfare state, in many ways, was a very noble achievement. But it doesn't necessarily make it easier for outsiders or immigrants to find their way into that society, because we're much more used to governments taking care of immigrant communities in the sense of paying them enough to survive and so on, but at the same time protecting the jobs of this so-called native population, having more regulations, making it difficult to get hired or fired, and which makes it much harder for outsiders to get a foothold in the workplace. And the workplace in the US, I think, is one of the main avenues towards integration. And I think that, as well as discrimination, which of course exists everywhere, is a serious impediment in European societies. I would remind you, as an illustration of this, of the fact that people often use the example of the riots in these immigrant suburbs of Paris several years ago, which of course had nothing to do with Islam. It was a mixed population, often African, Middle Eastern, people from all over. And there were serious riots, there was violence, and so on. But these riots were preceded by a political demonstration that took place, I think, only a week or so before. And those demonstrations were by and large, white, middle-class French university students who demonstrated against the possibility of the French government making it easier for people to be fired from their first jobs. In other words, they were demonstrating for their own security. And I don't think this was lost on the young people from immigrant communities in the French suburbs who saw exactly what was going on, and that it's the protection of those interests would actually make it harder for them to be hired and fired or hired. And the longer they stay in that position of limbo, of being unemployed, the worse things are going to get.
So your presentation was a great defense, which I have never heard of it in my work or my life. But with all due respect, I do have some reservation, and I wish to share it with you, if you don't mind. Reading the material from the 9th century on, there are some ideological perception of Islam relating to the land of what they call the Waqf, which is, you know, it died during the centuries. However, if you pay attention very closely to what is going on now in what I call the Club of the Admirers of God, or Admirers of Allah, which is all the religious schools, if you pay attention, there is a promotion of these works Al-Sirr of Abu Ishaq, Abu Ishaq the Alvira poet in Spain. All these materials suddenly comes into light. And the question is, should we ignore it? Or should we go slowly and talk to the people, have a dialogue with these people? I studied with a great philosopher, great thinkers, of the 20th century, and he emphasized that a dialogue is the most important thing and not really influencing other person. And that's what I really want to have with my colleagues or my friends in the Islamic world. What fears me is, and that is, I would like to have your response or your reaction to it, is that in Al-Jawf, a city or a small town in northern Yemen, there is a person by the name, he claimed that he is an imam, a very strong person by the name of Abdullah al-Badri, who stated the following: we shall na'tihum watan ala watar, which means we shall give them a land or homeland on a string of whatever. The question that I ask friends who are relating to him, what did he mean? And they said, you have to guess that. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, when you talk about dialogue with those people or the Islamic world, that sounds to me too vague, because I'm not quite sure who you mean by those people. And I don't think there's one Islamic world. I think that the difference between, say, the killer of Theo van Gogh and an imam in Yemen is immense. And I don't think you can quite see them as parts of the same problem. But let's assume you mean dialogue with the violent revolutionaries. I don't think that is very feasible, because once people has joined a holy war for political reasons, I don't think that they're particularly interested in dialogue, even if you or I might be. So I think that's a question for the police and not for dialogue. If what you mean is that an open mind towards Muslims is important, that we should have knowledge, that we should talk to Muslims who are law-abided European or citizens, then I don't see anything wrong with that. But, of course, they were not the problem in the first place. So dialogue sounds all very fine, but and there is a worldwide industry in dialogues, and it keeps many an academic gainfully employed, but it all sounds slightly vague to me.
Well, I don't think that a dialogue is a vague, sir, but this is a discussion between you and I. Yeah.
Sure. Oh, okay. Thank you again for this very helpful and enlightening lecture. You had many opportunities throughout the lecture and these questions to answer my question. You didn't, that's why I just came over here. I'm a Turkish delight myself. As you can guess from my accent, I have, as many Turks, several dozens of cousins who live in Germany, Holland, Belgium, France, and I made several visits to Europe and get in touch with many European Muslims who live in Europe. Most of those people that I know and I came across seemingly do not deserve to be beaten up by those sticks that you mentioned, but by any stretch of imagination. Like, they are not religious at all. Two of my cousins are openly gay and living with partners, and they are very well educated, finished best colleges, holding great professions, speak various languages. Seemingly, they don't deserve to be hit by religious, don't share the values, anti-gay, or any of those beautifully mentioned sticks you articulated. So that brings to my question. Maybe the whole integration problem of immigrants and Muslims in Europe is not entirely the problem of these primitive immigrants and their inherently violent religion, but the European society itself, maybe these European societies are not as tolerant, as enlightened as they often take pride, and maybe these European societies are still holding these deeply rooted exclusive elements within themselves that they are not compatible to live in global pluralistic realities.
Yes, I would agree with a lot of that. But again, I don't think you can reduce it to that. I don't think you can say the problem faced by immigrants in Europe now is European racism. I mean, I think but I would go with you a long way. I think it is, there are, how deep-rooted it is, I don't know, but it's certainly true that there are strong elements of xenophobia involved in all this, deliberately stirred up by politicians who who take their advantage from this. So yes, what more can I say about it? I think one problem is that the United States, and also France to some extent, although there it has somewhat different consequences, define themselves as a nation largely in terms of politics, of citizenship, of the Constitution, of pledging allegiance, and so on. It's fairly clear what it is to be an American citizen. It's not so clear what it is to be, let's say, a German citizen, even though the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas advocated, at a time when there was still, Germany was still divided, but he advocated what he called Verfassungspatriotismus, the constitutional patriotism. That has never quite worked in Europe to the extent that it works in the United States. And so,
sorry to interrupt, but any of these cousins and people that I know, they share seemingly all the European values.
yes, no, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to think out loud. I think that the European societies, and certainly the one I grew up in is one example of that, work a little bit like private clubs, which have their own unspoken rules, and people know what shoes to wear and what color tie to wear, and there are sort of tacit understandings and so on. Now, the members of these clubs don't necessarily hate non-members or want to beat them up, but certainly don't make it easy for them to be accepted as members. And so I think it is more complicated becoming a German or becoming a Brit, let alone an Englishman, than it is to become an American citizen. But that's not to excuse definite elements of xenophobia and racism, discrimination, which are there. They can't be denied.
Excuse me for asking a perhaps overdetermined question, since you come from the same country as Ayaan Hirsi Ali. In 3 European countries, in France, in Britain, and the Netherlands, there are outspoken young women, educated women from Muslim backgrounds who are not only passionately opposed to Islam and Islamicism, but also deeply committed against multiculturalism, against pluralism and toleration. If one of those women were here in the room, what would you say to her?
Well, that depends on what questions you would ask.
Well, okay. Ayaan Hirsi Ali says enough of this toleration of Islam. We have to get tough on Muslims. We have to require assimilation, not integration, and we have to get rid of them, the ones who don't want to assimilate. So
well,
that would be what Sharon Atish says, or Fatima Mernissi.
Okay. Well, if she or somebody like her were to ask me, do I think we should insist on assimilation, or would I think that we should get rid of them? My answer would be no. I think that's...
How would you convince her? Or would you?
I don't know if I can convince her, but I think it's slightly odd to have a discussion with somebody who's not here. Does everybody know who she is?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry? Ayaan Hirsi Ali, well, I mean, we have our serious differences, which were not intended by me to begin with. Ayaan Hirsi Ali comes from Somalia. Her father was a liberal opposition figure. She grew up partly in Kenya, partly in Saudi Arabia, and as a form of teenage rebellion became an ardent Islamist. She then, in order to escape from a forced marriage, ended up in Holland and was converted, and the word I think is apt, converted to atheism, which was almost as, and she's almost as ardent in her atheism as she was in her teenage Islamism. And so she doesn't really distinguish very clearly between, or certainly doesn't distinguish at all, between religious orthodoxy and political ideology. In other words, she actually said about 9/11, it's a mistake to think of this act as something that is linked to Islam. She said this is the core of Islam. Now, my argument with her is if that's the way we think, then we do end up having to deport people and put them in trains and kick them out. And we are then engaged in an all-out war, a Kulturkampf, against all Muslims, which would be a bloody disaster. So that's really my answer to her. Now, as far as the multiculturalism is concerned, I agree with her that the multiculturalist ideology, as it was still in the 80s and 90s amongst some people, that people of non-Western cultures in Western countries should be actively encouraged to stick to their own traditions, that those traditions are actually better than Western traditions, that if a father beats up his daughter, that's fine because that's his culture. If a woman gets murdered by her brothers because she had a boyfriend instead of getting married to a distant cousin, then we should understand that because that's in their culture. Now, that form of multiculturalist ideology, I think, was pernicious and should be criticized. But I don't think that's really very strong anymore, anywhere in Europe. And that's what I meant earlier on when I talked about flogging a dead horse. I think people who write books claiming that Europeans have no beliefs, that it's weak, that they don't stand up for their own culture, and that they're going to be defeated by these Muslims who believe fervently in their goal and their culture and so on. I think this is a wildly exaggerated and actually distorted picture.